It was supposed to be a quiet weekend by the lake. Just me, my fiancé, and our new pop-up tent we'd been dying to try out until Karen showed up and made it her personal mission to ruin everything, not knowing that this time she was messing with the wrong person. I had no idea when I pulled up to Lot 23 that this camping trip would lead to a chain of events that would end with the entire HOA losing their lake rights, their board getting shut down, and Karen's reputation shattered across 3 counties. But sometimes justice has a strange way of working itself out. My family had owned a small slice of lakefront land for over 25 years, grandfathered in long before the HOA even existed, and every summer we'd set up camp for a few relaxing weekends. This year was special. My fiancée Rachel had just finished a grueling semester of med school, and we needed this break more than ever. We arrived Friday morning, set up our tent just a few feet from the waterline, laid out our folding chairs, and began grilling burgers by noon. That's when we saw her short bob haircut, oversized sunglasses, a bright neon HOA volunteer vest, even though no one had asked her to wear one. She strutted across the grass like she owned the shoreline, eyeing us like we were dumping toxic waste into the lake. I didn't think anything of it at first. A lot of HOA types like to play authority, but she walked right up to our grill, nose flared, hands on hips, and snapped, "You can't camp here. This area is for HOA members only." I looked her square in the face and calmly said, "My family's owned this land since before the HOA was even formed. You don't have jurisdiction here." It set her off like a firecracker. "I'll be contacting the board," she huffed. This kind of activity is unsanctioned, and it reflects badly on our lake community. Rachel, bless her, tried to keep things civil. But Karen had already dialed someone later. I'd find out it was the HOA president and snapped pictures of our tent, our car, even the food we were cooking. We brushed it off, figuring she'd get bored and move on. But less than an hour later, a uniformed HOA safety officer showed up in a golf cart and handed us a formal notice, accusing us of unauthorized tent placement, noise violations, and unregistered guests. I laughed. "You've got to be kidding me," I said, but the guy was dead serious. Failure to comply could result in a fine or further legal action. He didn't even realize we were on private property. That's when I pulled out our property deed. From my folder, I always brought it, just in case Ann said, "Why don't you take this back to Karen and your little club and try reading it out loud?" He didn't know how to respond, just nodded, muttered something, and drove off. But the damage was done. Rachel was furious. "This is harassment," she said, and she wasn't wrong. I decided I'd had enough. If Karen wanted to play games, then I was ready to play back. I spent the rest of the evening documenting everything: video of her walking onto our land, snapshots of the warning notice, audio of her barking orders over the phone. I called my cousin, an attorney, who advised me to file a formal complaint with the county land office and let them know an HOA was attempting to enforce rules outside their jurisdiction. The next day I did exactly the damned. Then I started digging. I looked up the HOA's lake usage agreement, and what I found blew the lid off the whole thing. Turns out the HOA didn't actually own any part of the lakefront. They had what was called a conditional access lease with the Parks Department, renewed every 5 years, contingent on good behavior and cooperation with non-member landowners. One formal complaint, one documented incident of overreach, and that lease could be terminated immediately. Karen had no idea that by stepping onto our land and attempting to issue fake violations, she was handing me the ammunition I needed to dismantle the very foundation of her little OA empire. And trust me, I plan to use it. Because when someone tries to ruin your peace over a tent and a couple burgers and acts like they're sheriff of the water, they deserve to learn the hard way that you don't mess with someone who knows the law better than you do. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen who thought rules didn't apply to her, make sure you follow Sham stories right now, because you won't believe how this ends. The next morning, while Rachel prepared breakfast by the water, I sat on a folding chair with a coffee in one hand and my laptop in the other, determined to peel back every layer of the HOA's grip on this lake. The deeper I dug, the more ridiculous their operation looked. Karen's HOA had been operating under the radar for years, maintaining control over shared amenities with a mix of intimidation, technical jargon, and outdated paperwork. Most residents around the lake either didn't care or were too passive to challenge them, and those who did speak up usually got buried in process. Their lake access committee wasn't even a legal entity. It was a voluntary body granted access only because of the conditional lease with the county. I found public meeting notes, PDFs buried in county records, and a scanned copy of their most recent lease renewal. Everything hinged on them not interfering with private property or creating public nuisance complaints against landowners. Two things Karen had blatantly done within a single afternoon. After breakfast, we saw Karen again. She wasn't alone this time. Two more members from the HOA board, Dan, older, man in a pastel shirt, and a woman who looked like she'd been pulled out of a yoga retreat, stood with her on the edge of our boundary line, whispering while staring daggers in our direction. I didn't say anything to them. I just pulled out my phone and started filming. They didn't like that. Karen stormed back over, this time even more aggressive. "You don't have the right to film me," she snapped. "You're invading my privacy." I replied calmly, "We're on our private property, Karen. I can film anything that happens on it. Thank you for giving me more evidence." That's when the yoga lady chimed in, claiming they'd been given community authority too. "Document unsafe setups on the lakefront." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Unsafe? We're eating pancakes?" I let them rant a little more and then told them they were trespassing. Karen scoffed and said she'd be back with the county ranger. That was a mistake, because I'd already called the parks department myself earlier that morning and scheduled a visit with a ranger to come inspect everything. Around noon, Ranger Delgado arrived, uniformed, professional, and very by the book. He shook my hand and introduced himself, then asked for a walkthrough of the situation. I showed him everything. Our deed, the HOA's fake violation notice, video clips, especially the clause from their lease agreement that forbade interfering with private landowners. Delgado took notes and looked genuinely annoyed. "Pulled stunts like this before," he said, "but this is the clearest overstep I've seen. They're going to regret it." While he was there, Karen returned with a smug smile, clearly expecting him to side with her. That smile melted the second she realized he was already standing in our camp, reviewing documents. "Excuse me, Ranger, I need to speak with you privately," she said. Delgado didn't even turn. "You can speak here, Ms. Worthington." She started into her usual tirade about unregistered camping. Fire hazards, community disturbance, all of it, complete fiction. Delgado let her go on for a minute before calmly asking, "Do you have documentation showing jurisdiction over this?" "Parcel," Karen faltered. "Well, not exactly, but the HOA. Then I'm going to have to ask you to return to your property, ma'am. This is private land, and your behavior is bordering on harassment." The silence that followed was glorious. Karen's face went red, but she turned on her heel and stomped away, her entourage trailing behind her like scolded children. Delgado turned to me and said, "If you'd like to file a formal complaint with the Parks Department and county office, I'll back it with my report." I nodded. I would. That evening, I wrote the most detailed, professional, and damning complaint I could, attaching all evidence. The ranger's name and citations from the HOA's lease agreement. I filed it with the county clerk and copied the Parks Department's administration office. Then, for good measure, I emailed a copy to my cousin, who forwarded it to a local news blog that loved running stories about HOA abuse. By the next day, the fire had started to spread. The blog ran a piece titled, "Lakefront HOA, Accused of Trespassing, Harassment by Longtime Property Owner." It included stills of Karen's confrontations, direct quotes from the ranger, and even a line from Rachel that read, "All we wanted was a peaceful weekend. Instead, we were treated like criminals by people who have no authority." Comments poured in. Turns out Karen and her crew weren't just bothering US, they had a history of targeting other landowners too, especially younger couples or seasonal renters. The HOA had been hiding behind community language to bully anyone who didn't fall in line. The county response was swift. Within days, a hearing was scheduled to review the HOA's lease. I was invited to speak, along with the ranger and several others who came forward with their own stories. Karen's empire was crumbling. At the hearing, she tried to show up looking dignified, wearing a conservative blazer and acting like the victim. But the board wasn't buying it. When they read Ranger Delgado's report aloud and showed clips from the blog's footage, the entire room shifted against her. The final blow came when an older gentleman who had owned land on the opposite side of the lake since the 1980s stood up and said that HOA has forgotten its place. They treat this lake like a kingdom, and everyone who's not in their circle like trespassers. The Parks Department voted unanimously to suspend the HOA's lake lease pending a full investigation. In the meantime, all HOA signage, enforcement, and scheduled events were canceled. Karen sat frozen, like her whole identity had been stripped from her in 5 minutes, and in a way it had, because without the lake access and their false sense of authority, the HOA was just another overgrown committee with too much time and not enough purpose. Rachel and I returned to our camp the next weekend, this time with even more neighbors joining us. It became a kind of celebration picnic. Tables, music, laughter. The atmosphere was different now, lighter, free. Karen didn't show her face. Rumor had it she was considering stepping down from the board entirely, but honestly, I didn't care. I'd made my point, and the lake was peaceful again. What happened over the next 2 weeks could only be described as a community awakening. The takedown of Karen's precious HOA lake access didn't just clear a path for my own peace, it sparked something much bigger. Homeowners who had once tiptoed around Karen and her board began speaking out. The neighborhood Facebook group, which had been tightly moderated by Karen and her loyalists, suddenly filled with posts from residents recounting years of petty fines, threats over garden decor, intimidation about fence heights, and unsolicited compliance checks that were nothing more than HOA board members snooping around private yards. One man, Doug, posted a picture of a $75 citation he received for having a faded wreath on his door 2 years ago. Karen told me it clashed with community aesthetics, he wrote. I took it down and paid the fine because I didn't want trouble, but I wish I'd spoken up back then. Comments flooded in. Same here. She did that to my sister's mailbox. She tried to fine me for painting my garage the same shade it had always been. It was like a dam had burst. These weren't just one-off incidents. This was a systemic abuse of authority built on fear and silence. The Parks Department's suspension of the HOA's lake rights had sent a message, and now everyone was realizing they no longer had to live under Karen's manufactured rulebook. For me, the unexpected part was how much support I began receiving. People started stopping by my house just to thank me. One elderly woman baked us a pie. Another neighbor offered to help us clear a few fallen branches from our shoreline. Couple even dropped off a folding picnic table and said, "We saw what you did out there. We want to be part of it next time." And it wasn't just local. The news blog that broke our story ran a follow-up titled Lake HOA Fallout. Dozens speak out against Karen's rule. That article got picked up by a regional YouTube channel, which turned it into a 10-minute video with clips of Karen yelling, side by side with documents from the lease investigation. It exploded online. Within days, the video had over 200,000 views, with thousands of comments from people across the country sharing their own HOA horror stories. The pressure mounted on Karen, and it became impossible for her to keep pretending. She was just doing her duty. The rest of the HOA board, sensing the ship was sinking, started distancing themselves. I got a call from Linda Myers, the treasurer, who quietly told me she and 2 other board members had voted to remove Karen as president, pending a vote by the homeowners. We didn't know the full extent of what she was doing, she said. But now, it's clear we have to start over. I appreciated the call, but I wasn't convinced. Karen hadn't just been a rogue leader, he'd built a culture of control. It wasn't enough to just remove her, the whole foundation had to change, so I decided to attend the next public HOA meeting. It was held in the clubhouse, a sterile room that usually hosted yoga classes and board game nights. But that evening, it was packed with angry, frustrated, and curious residents. I took a seat near the front, Rachel beside me, arms crossed, eyes scanning the crowd. Karen sat at the head of the board's table, trying to keep composure, but it was clear she was unraveling. People took turns at the microphone, sharing their grievances. Some were polite but firm. Others were furious. Man said, I've lived here for 18 years, and I've never felt less welcome than under this board's reign. Another woman, holding back tears, said Karen tried to fine her for planting roses in her front yard because they weren't on the approved foliage list. When my turn came, I stood up slowly and said, I didn't come here to tear anyone down. But when someone tries to use made-up rules to trample on rights, on private property, on peace and quiet, that's where I draw the line. I won't apologize for standing up, and no one else here should either. The room erupted in applause. Karen didn't say much. When the vote came to officially remove her, it passed 92-8. Her face stayed frozen, and she walked out without a word. It would have been enough for most people, but I still wasn't done. The HOA had too much power, more than it ever should have had, and now that the residents were awake, I saw a chance to change everything. I began organizing a committee with other homeowners to revise the HOA charter. We held informal meetings by the lake, hosted cookouts, and brought in legal experts to explain our options. Our goal wasn't anarchy, it was accountability. We wanted term limits for board members, clear limits on fines, full transparency on how funds were spent, and, above all, rules that made sense for modern living. It took weeks of work, but the turnout was incredible. People brought ideas, drafted language, voted on each proposal. What started as a reaction to Karen's power grab turned into a genuine movement for better community governance. Of these lakeside gatherings, a man I didn't know well approached me and introduced himself as Brent Holloway. You probably don't remember, he said, but Karen had my daughter's birthday party shut down last year because we had too many balloons. I blinked. Seriously? He nodded. She called it a visual distraction to drivers. We both laughed, and he shook my hand. Thank you for putting an end to it. Stories like that kept rolling in. At least a dozen families had some ridiculous anecdote involving Karen and her clipboard of doom. In one case, she even threatened to report a lemonade stand run by 2 10-year-old girls for commercial activity. The absurdity of it all would have been funny if it hadn't been so infuriating. Still, with every story, every meeting, every small act of resistance, the culture changed. The lake became what it was always meant to be, a shared space for everyone, not just a playground for power-hungry enforcers. The new charter passed with overwhelming support. We renamed the HOA into a neighborhood council, stripped it of enforcement authority, and converted it into a voluntary community resource group. Karen's name was removed from all records. She tried once to file a complaint with the county about harassment, but no one listened. Too much had been exposed. Her power was gone. And the lake, for the first time in years, felt truly open. The weeks after the charter reform felt like breathing fresh air in a space that had been suffocating for years. Like the lake had been set free, and so had we. People started using the shoreline more freely, without the fear of surprise compliance visits or Karen's infamous clipboard inspections. Children played near the water, teens kayaked without being questioned about permission slips, and families began organizing potlucks, movie nights, and small festivals. What had once been a guarded, exclusive environment filled with cold glares and passive-aggressive notes was becoming a true community. Rachel and I hosted a lakeside barbecue with a modest goal, maybe a dozen people. Some neighbors, some friends from town, but the turnout was massive. Nearly 60 people showed up, each bringing a dish, a cooler, or even their own folding chairs. As the sun dipped behind the pine trees, music played from a Bluetooth speaker, and someone started a fire pit while kids roasted marshmallows. The lake sparkled under twilight, peaceful and open, as if it, too, were relieved that Karen was no longer the self-appointed gatekeeper. The strangest part was how many people admitted they had been quietly enduring Karen's rule for years. One neighbor named Kathy told me that Karen once threatened to report her daughter's wedding photo shoot as a commercial event and insisted she remove the string lights they had hung along the dock. Another family said they received a formal warning for unauthorized signage because of a hand-painted welcome sign their son made at school. It was like Karen had weaponized every single rule in the book, and plenty that weren't even written down, just to feel in control. With every story I heard, I realized how deeply her behavior had impacted people, instilling a kind of quiet fear that had slowly poisoned the joy of living by the lake. So as the new council moved forward, I felt an obligation to not just enjoy the change, but to protect it. We established a digital newsletter to keep everyone informed, started a rotating open meeting schedule to encourage broader participation, and created an anonymous online forum for submitting ideas and grievances, no more being publicly shamed at meetings. The biggest change came when the Parks Department formally ended the HOA's lease to manage the lakefront. They stated that, going forward, the area would fall under direct county oversight with input from a neighborhood advisory board made up of both residents and county representatives. The decision effectively stripped any remaining illusion of control the HOA once had. And it also meant the council or new, reformed body could serve as a liaison rather than an enforcer. It felt right, balanced, civil. Of course, Karen didn't disappear entirely. I spotted her once at the grocery store aisle near the cleaning supplies. Her eyes met mine, then darted away. She looked smaller, somehow not physically, but in presence. The entitled had that air of command, the entitled strut, the cold confidence of someone who believed she could dictate how others lived. Rumor had it she'd been trying to form a splinter HOA in another section of the county, but no one was taking her seriously. She'd become a cautionary tale. People no longer whispered her name in fear. They said it with eye rolls, chuckles, or flat-out disdain. She hated that. Around that time, I was approached by a producer from a mid-sized YouTube documentary channel that focused on HOA abuse, small-town drama, and social reform. They had picked up the regional news story and were fascinated by how our lake community had turned things around. They wanted to film interviews, walk the shoreline, even get drone footage of where the confrontation happened. I was hesitant at first, not wanting to relive the tension or give Karen a reason to re-enter the narrative. But after discussing it with Rachel and a few council members, we decided to do it not for attention, but for education. Maybe other communities dealing with their own HOA nightmares could find a bit of courage from our story. The production took about 3 days, interviewed a range of people. Ranger Delgado, who had since been promoted and spoke proudly of his involvement. My cousin, the attorney, who had helped us navigate the legal filings. And even former board members who admitted they'd blindly trusted Karen too long. The final video, titled HOA Karen vs. The Tent, the Lakefront Take-Back Story, was nearly 25 minutes long and exploded within the first week. It garnered over 500,000 views and was flooded with comments like, "This is the most satisfying takedown I've ever seen." And every HOA needs to watch this before they try to control people's lives. Some viewers even emailed us asking for copies of our revised charter as a template for their own communities. I never thought a weekend camping trip would turn into a national example of reclaiming peace from pettiness, but here we were. Rachel and I became minor local celebrities. The mayor invited us to speak at a community town hall about neighborhood governance, and local papers dubbed us the couple who tamed the lake. It was surreal, humbling, and a little funny, considering we had only wanted to roast hot dogs in peace. Meanwhile, Karen had become somewhat of a recluse. She rarely left her house, and the few times she did, it was early morning or late evening. She sold her neon vest online. Someone screenshotted on Facebook Marketplace with the caption, "Retired. Tyrant sells her crown, but the bitterness hadn't faded." I received one last letter from her, postmarked anonymously, typed in all caps. It read, "You think you've won, but this community will collapse without order." I smiled when I read it, then slid it into a folder labeled "Just in Case." I didn't need to reply. The peaceful waters outside my window said more than words ever could. There were no more patrols, no more warnings, no more citations for flowers, tents, flags, or lawn chairs. People were gardening again, painting again, living again. And the lake, once ruled by fear, now echoed with laughter, music, and the soft splash of paddle boards drifting freely under the open sky. Months passed, and the transformation around the lake was no longer just visible, it was alive. The community, once bound in fear and quiet compliance under Karen's scrutiny, had found its voice, and that voice was now carried in every splash. From a carefree child, every sizzling grill on a summer weekend, and every warm conversation exchanged between neighbors who had once avoided each other behind drawn blinds. What started as a spontaneous getaway to escape the pressure of city life had unfolded into something much bigger, a full-scale unraveling of HOA. Tyranny and the beginning of something honest and real. The rebranded Neighborhood Council, now fully transparent and community-run, had become a model for other HOAs across the state. We even hosted a regional summit on community self-governance, inviting legal experts, town officials, and residents from nearby lake associations to learn from our journey. No one missed the old days of Karen's regime, not even her former allies who, in their own quiet ways, had started volunteering to clean the lakeside park or help with event planning just to prove they stood with the people now. Rachel and I continued to live in our family home by the water, but everything about the experience felt different, lighter, warmer, freer. One evening, we sat on the same patch of grass where that first confrontation had taken place. The place where Karen had stood towering over our grill with that clipboard like a petty dictator. But this time, we were surrounded by neighbors. Doug played guitar by the fire pit. Kathy handed out lemonade. Kids darted between folding tables, sticky with melted popsicles and cookie crumbs. I looked out across the lake and saw a handful of kayaks drifting lazily toward the sunset. No one yelling at them, no one blowing a whistle or filing a complaint. The water glowed with the kind of stillness that felt earned. Rachel leaned against me and said, "You know what's funny? All this started over a tent." And it really had. That single pop-up tent we had pitched out of love for the outdoors had exposed a web of control, entitlement, and manipulation that no one had dared confront till we did. And the beauty of it was, we weren't alone for long. Others had followed, not because we asked, but because they had been waiting for a reason to rise. Karen's story didn't end with a bang or a big public apology. It ended with her quietly selling her lake house 6 months later and moving to a different subdivision to towns over. Some people said she tried to run for a board position there, but the HOA already knew her name. Someone had forwarded them the YouTube documentary. She didn't get the votes. She faded into obscurity, which, for someone like her, was the worst possible fate. But this story was never really about her. It was about how one person's obsession with control can be undone by a community's choice to unite, speak up, and reclaim what was always theirs. There were no more anonymous fines, no more angry notes left on doors, no more neighborhood compliance sweeps. Instead, there were bonfires, laughter, shared meals, and people helping one another out of choice, not fear. Rachel and I kept the tent, cleaned it, packed it carefully into its case, and stored it in the garage. Not because we planned to use it again, but because it had become a symbol, a quiet reminder that even the smallest things, when challenged, can stand up to the loudest bullies. Every now and then, someone would bring up the story again, usually around a fire or during a late-night lakeside chat. They'd say, "Remember when Karen tried to take over the whole lake?" And we'd laugh. Not because it was funny then, but because we had survived it, tanned, rebuilt something stronger in its place. If you've ever dealt with an HOA Karen, if you've ever been silenced by someone hiding behind a rule book, or if you've ever been made to feel like a guest on your own property, let this be your sign. You don't have to take it. Stand your ground. Know your rights. And if someone tries to bully you with authority they don't have, document everything and fight back with truth, community, and the law on your side. Thank you for following our story from start to finish. If you love seeing justice served and HOA Karens put in their place, make sure you subscribe to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, where real drama meets real consequences. And remember, sometimes all it takes is one tent, one voice, and one moment of courage to change everything.